The Project. Kuwait. Learn. Live.
Hey everybody, welcome to The Project, and I'm throwing a curveball at everybody tonight. We had Dr. Vera, the author of Food Junkies.
That's right, Vera Tarman, yes.
World-renowned author. Dr. D got to geek out with her psychology questions.
That's right.
Megan, her gut health. I mean, you guys were talking about gut flora. I was just playing around on my phone. I was like, I don't know what's going on. No, I'm joking.
I love the way she calls herself a food addict in recovery. I just love it. She's so honest. The conversation was flowing. It was an amazing interview, actually.
I think that's the biggest takeaway of this is understanding the stigmas of addiction in general,
Yes.
but the differentiation between disordered eating and food addiction, what that exactly is, the whole social side of it, the personal side of it, and some really good tips to give you some light at the end of the tunnel on how to overcome maybe some of those things that you're confused about. Is it an addiction or is it just disordered eating or is it stress? I think she really gives some good tips to think about.
And I think all her stories actually are amazing because you can relate to it no matter what. And also can bring light to people that are food addict that don't really know that they're food addict. And the comparison she makes with, substance abuse and addiction was amazing. So,
And guys, she gets into some of the science behind it, especially when it comes to insulin sensitivity. And she talks about ghrelin. She talks about everything that goes on with your body from a chemical perspective and a hormonal perspective. So I get into some of those geeky questions, as we were calling them.
and we did the fluffy question.
I know, you guys did the fluffy questions, especially Meg. She sucked it up this time. But it was great.
I think it's because I already know the geeky stuff.
Ooh, snap, she got me there. But it was
too.
great. And just kind of like bear with us because we had some connection problems here and there. But all in all, it was a great episode. And I loved when she talked about her book at the end and the stories behind her book and what went into that and why she wanted to relate it to the readers. That was great. So give it a listen. And guys, leave us a rating and review on iTunes and you get a chance to win a limited edition Project Kuwait t-shirt.
Yes.
I want one.
I want one.
You guys aren't getting one.
All this and more in today's episode.
One of my now favorite guests on this show, Dr. Vera, right? Dr. D, I'm assuming you and Meg, too, love this.
Yeah, that's right.
It's right up your alleys. One gut expert and one head expert. I love it.
It's where our paths cross.
I know, right? So, Dr. Vera, I think you could do a better job at kind of, throwing your credentials out there and, letting people understand what your background is.
The medical director of a treatment center in Toronto, Canada called Renown, which is a treatment center for drugs and alcohol. And I've been working in the field of addiction medicine for over 20 years. I've been a doctor for, I guess, now 30 years plus, but an addictions doctor for about 20 years. And in the last 5 to 6 years, myself first, and then the program that I work for got very interested in the whole idea of treatment for food addiction.
The most interesting in the first couple of chapters of your book was going through about we don't relate food addiction on the same level as you typically do with like alcohol and drugs. And it was just really interesting, that fact that was thrown out there right away of people that kind of transition from one to the other, the former alcoholics that then get into a food addiction, or someone with the bypass surgery who then goes into a food addiction, or bulimia and alcoholism, and the relationship between that. I found that to be really shocking.
Yeah, that's really what happened to me. I work with new recovery. Like, people are coming in and I see them for the first month and they put down their drug and all of a sudden their hands are full of candies and chips and pop. And I would say to them, is this your pattern? And they'd say, no, I never ate like this before. What's wrong with me? Then my antenna went up and I started asking people, what about before you picked up your drug? What was your food pattern like? And I would say at least 40% of the people, especially women, would say, I actually think I ate like this before. And then I started to drink, or I started to use another drug, even cigarettes. I started to smoke cigarettes. Then my food was under control and I thought that wasn't a problem. But now it is again.
Yeah.
So to me, when it's in my face, connecting the dots was not hard. What was hard was when I started telling my dietary colleagues, and Megan, I'm sure you can relate to this, the diet nutritionists who advise about food, when I started telling them about the addictive nature of some of the foods that we're eating, that's where there was a stonewalling, not with the clients.
Of what they were kind of advising.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, and it's kind of jumping into the whole conspiracy theory thing here. All right. Now, we know that big tobacco, right, created addictive cigarettes. They knew they were highly addictive when they created them. And then I've read multiple articles saying that a lot of the large tobacco companies purchased food companies, some of the biggest food companies.
Yeah.
Do you believe that they're creating these hyper palatable foods that are so extraordinarily addictive, especially to children?
Oh my God. Yes. I'm inclined to say that's not a conspiracy theory. It's just plain commercial. Once you start reading, how can you not make that connection? The fact that we know, my guess is that you are leading to this. We have people who are food engineers deliberately making foods to be, well, you said hyper palatable. Let's just call it what it is, which is addictive. I think that that's a deliberate intent. I think most people who have read anything beyond just the superficial are coming to that conclusion now. Just a matter of legal and economic forces to change the tide.
Right. When you talked about some of those clinicians and things kind of almost guiding their clients on a more destructive path as like far as the food goes, like what were those recommendations, or what do you think like the intention was with that? Like what were they hoping they would fix, and then what was created out of it?
Well, when I think about conspiracy theory, this is where I think it goes. Like, I think that there's enough now in the media about the food industry and the connection with big tobacco that's not so outlandish anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But in the medical world, I might be faulted, but I don't know if I am, in the sense of, is there some kind of, not conspiracy, but a similar economic motivation to recommend foods that perpetuate diabetes so that we can keep a medical industry going, like a pharmaceutical industry for diabetes going, as opposed to the more obvious solution, which is to stop eating the things that are causing diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true.
Causing the need for gastric surgery.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't need to do the extent of bariatric surgery if we initially first got rid of foods, changed the diet that the nutritionist is suggesting, because they're suggesting, yes, you can eat a certain amount of carbs and a certain amount of sugar, basically toxins, addictive toxins, and it's up to you to control it. Well, of course, that's not possible.
Well, and that's something big that's going to touch on, especially in Kuwait.
But we also have the fastest growing population in diabetes in the world.
It fits because you also have a very high population of obesity, not even overweight, but obese. Like, I think there's a figure of 40%. That's obese. That's more than the U.S.
And most people here will not think about, they will think about a surgery before they can really think about their relationship with food. And I think this is why it's so important that we're having this, because a lot of our listeners are also on this part of the world. I would like to ask you, what would be the best way to be able to explain it to a society that everything they do surrounds food? I mean, I'm assuming it would be the same thing as, Hispanic families but here it seems like there's nowhere you go. Everyone wants to meet with you. They'll meet at a cafe where there is sweets. And when you go to their houses, and it's culturally inappropriate if you say, no, I don't want. But what I know, and what I found out is that, as a clinician here, I was fascinated by a lot of the stuff that you're saying, because it really does touch home. Because here, for example, a mom will encourage a daughter to be eating. Ellen was my favorite. So the idea is that when you have home and the mom is telling you to eat, but then they create these obese children. And then when they are 15, 16, mom is worried that she might not get married, the girl, and then recommends plastic surgery, for example, or recommends these geriatric kind of. And so there's always a struggle. So me as a clinician, trying to educate them, and I mean, your book was very educational for me. I'm going to use it a lot. But how do you tell someone that what you have is an addiction, as of like you're having an addiction of alcohol and drugs? People still don't understand it is the same.
No. Yeah, I understand what you're talking about, and that's a problem that we have as well. I think probably less than you do, but it's still a problem, only because my guess is we're a little bit further ahead on the discussion about what to do in terms of addiction and stuff. I mean, this has to be a policy decision. You are trying to work with individual people. You are one person, and probably unique and unusual in your voice, talking to people. It has to be global or societal, because once that daughter walks into her, like you said, a family event and says, well, I can't eat this stuff because it'll make my diabetes worse,
I'm
Yes.
glad you brought up a little bit of the science there, because I have a couple of scientific questions that I kind of understand, but I was hoping you could clarify for the audience. One was on the dopamine D2 receptors that you talk about in the book. I was hoping you can clarify what that is in terms of addiction. And then I have a follow-up question in terms of insulin sensitivity in the foods that we consume. And there are new products coming out like the Lumen, and there's like an insulin reader where it tells you if you eat an orange, if you have a spike in insulin, if it's good for you or bad for you. So can you talk about that a little bit?
So really what you're asking me about are the sort of two drives to eat and how they can be mismanaged.
Exactly.
And there's the hormonal model, which is true. Like both of them are true, and they actually work together. And as much as you will get the medical community to agree, we will all agree that there is a hormonal drive to eat that can get mismanaged, and that's primarily through the insulin effect. So if you eat too much sugar, the insulin drives, and then that creates obesity and creates more hunger. I mean, it creates its own drive to eat. Highly dense, sugar-dense, fat-dense foods. When I say fat, I mean sugar with fat. And the foods that we eat are engineered to make that already mismanaged. So you don't even have to be addicted to food to be eating too much. You just eat too much because you're having a hypoglycemic crash. You've eaten a lot 2 hours ago. Now you're crashing. You need more sugar to feel normal. So you're going to eat more to feel normal. And we know over time, a person becomes insulin not sensitive to their insulin, and eventually the condition of diabetes occurs.
You talked about the overuse of insulin receptors and their effects, and you also discussed leptin a little bit. Can you talk about that? Can you explain? It was really explained very beautifully in the book. Yeah. So
when I talk about this is now still just the hormonal model, because there's also the addictive model, just the hormonal model. The ideal way that we should eat, the way that our bodies are, in terms of, if you want to call it paleo, hunting and gathering, or whatever, the way our bodies were evolved to eat. We're supposed to eat real food, not processed food, but real food, which means that there's a certain amount of sugar in fruit and vegetables and whatnot. And our body, with the amount of insulin that's required to transport the sugar to the brain and whatnot, it's all good. It's great. My hunger cue is a hormone called ghrelin or ghrelin, depending on who you talk to. And that hunger is, if you want to think of a scale of 0 starvation and 100 stuff, that's around a 4 or something. You're hungry, but you're not starving. And we think about food serenity, food sobriety. You want to be in the realm of between 4 when you're hungry and 7 when you're full, not stuff, but 7 when you're full. That's ghrelin is 4, and leptin is the hormone of satiety that is released from the gut about 20 minutes after you eat.
That's like my number one habit that I discuss with everybody before, like focusing on really what you need to be eating. It's just like slow down, and it's for that exact hormonal
and
reason.
When you're eating processed food, it's done in 5 minutes because it's already pre-processed. So we've got ghrelin on one end and leptin on the other, and it's a perfect match. It works great. And insulin is, it's all perfect. When a person is eating processed food, on the glycemic index, you end up having a bolus of more sugar than your body is easily managed, then basically the whole insulin that becomes involved. So insulin has its own hunger cue, and it's the kind of hunger of when you're starved or ravished and the fuel is low, and if I don't eat, I will be crazy. I'm crazy with hungry. I'm going to eat anything in sight. If you've ever felt that way, it's not ghrelin hunger, it's insulin. I'm hypoglycemic, my sugar is low, the fuel for the brain is getting lower. So then we eat, but we eat too much, we become insulin resistant, and then the whole system is in abeyance. It doesn't work well anymore.
What are some cues or, I guess, things that you do with people to get them to understand, like, at what point is that hunger an emergency?
Exactly. So if the person is eating natural food, like non-processed food, then their natural hunger cues of just being full kick in. But when you are full and you see extra food or you see a dessert, you're full, but you're hungry, you know that that's not a real hunger cue. That's insulin, and that's now dopamine. There's something else happening. And when you ask the question, how do we know? I don't want to say once you're damaged forever, but a person who's been eating for a long time really forgets what it's like to be hungry, true hunger. Yeah. Because we become so overwhelmed by the insulin hunger, the famished, ravaged hunger.
And the signals are always around us. I mean, food is constantly around us. Like we've talked about this before. There's no inappropriate place and time really to be eating anymore.
Yes. And so what you're now talking about is the other
neurological side.
Exactly. So what we talked about the hormonal piece, and then we've got the other piece, which is the neurological, the neurochemistry, the dopamine and the dopamine 2 receptor. So when I am full and I walk into a buffet and I see something that's, oh my God, that's really tasty, what's happening is my dopamine has now picked up curiosity. Oh, that's good. I want to see what that tastes like. And I start to develop a hunger because hunger kicks off dopamine. Like that's a connection in and of itself. So now you're hungry, but it's a dopamine hunger. And that works fine if it's normal food, because, when you're hungry, you think about food and it works fine. But when you're eating a highly processed food, you're not hungry anymore, but you still want to eat. And I actually think that the neurological hunger is much more powerful than natural hunger, because we can eat until we're stuffed and still want to eat more.
You always get people here that saying, well, I'm not really addicted to food. I just love food. So whenever you try to ask about the process of it, then, whenever people come to me and they're talking about their weight and how they're frustrated about being obese and that they want to make a change in lifestyle. And then I say, well, it sounds like you might be addicted or, of course, in psychology, we talk a lot about emotional eating, which is my next question. If you can, I know that in some of your interviews, you really did talk about food addiction and how is that a food addiction is the same as emotional eating, which is something really big here. I've noticed in my practice is emotional. So the idea is that when someone says, well, I'm not really addicted, I just love food. What do you say to people like this?
How I would handle that kind of question is to say that there's a continuum, and food by its dopaminergic function, and it's not just dopamine, it also serotonin and endorphins. It provides the comfort because it is a fuel, and anything that's good for us feels good. And when we talk about a continuum, first of all, anything that's a pleasure creates dopamine, but you can eat something and you're not addicted to it, nor are you emotionally in need of it. So that would be at the one end. And then you may have problems, just like if you have a couple of drinks, you have a dessert, you feel a little bit better because it's giving you a neurological Band-Aid of either endorphin or a combination of dopamine, endorphin, and serotonin. It doesn't mean that you're addicted to it, you just like it. But when we talk about it becoming an addiction, just like with somebody who's drinking every once in a while just to get to sleep, we're not saying they're an alcoholic yet. It's when there's a dependency that becomes developed. And now there's also impairment around. I'm now needing that drink to get to sleep at night, that tub of ice cream to get to sleep at night, or the muffin to get through the morning. I need that, even though I'm sick. So now we've got impairment, we've got dependency, plus the comfort. Then we're moving into that realm of addiction.
What is it about the night snacking, I guess, aspect of it? I think people in there, I think nighttime tends to be the most difficult time for people dealing with that. Is there anything around that behavior wise or what?
I think it's a combination both of probably the food that they ate a few hours earlier. They're now actually having a hypoglycemic crash. You can't sleep when your fuel is down. You become agitated and irritable. You can't sleep. Plus, this is pure psychology. You develop a pattern of behavior. At night, I want to be comfortable. I know this food. It's almost like a stimulus response thing. I know that this will help me sleep. It becomes a mental crutch to help me fall asleep, which if I don't have it, I don't sleep.
Right.
Sorry, I was going to say, talking about mental crutches, just because this question that I have falls right into it. And you talked about in chapter 5, the side effects of fructose. In the diet. And now a lot of people will switch to the diet foods and then they think that's okay because now I'm doing diet soda. But you talk about it in the book that fructose is actually addictive or just as addictive, and it has addictive properties in terms of mental and physiological, I think. So if you can dive into that a little bit, that would be awesome.
Well, fructose is a fruit sugar. It's half of a fruit sugar, so it's an actual sugar. But I think you're meaning the artificial sweeteners like stevia or aspartame. So what we're talking about there is neurological hunger, like I said earlier, I think is more powerful than hormonal hunger, but we can mess up just on hormonal. But when we have artificial sweeteners, we're anticipating the anticipation of sweet. You eat something, it tastes sweet, the body responds as if it is sweet. And so you end up having a mini euphoric response from the sweetener. And if you are green, new, naive to the whole thing, you can probably get away with sweetener. But if you've been eating stuff for a long time, things don't stay the same. Addiction is chronic and progressive. The more we eat this stuff, over time, we're getting worse. And you become trigger happy even to artificial sweeteners at some point that you might not early on, which is why some people, Dr. D, in your practice may truly just still love food. But I would say that's only a yet. Give them more time in this food environment, and they're going to be back in your couch or chair or office with much more severe problems. It doesn't stay at one place. And sweeteners only contributes to that process.
Yeah, it's true.
Plus, by the way, there's research now suggesting that probably has an insulin effect too that we're not quite sure of, but there's something going on there.
I was just going to ask that question too.
Yeah, I think we're just on the cusp of that. And you must have seen in the paper just in the last couple of days, I was just floored by this. The idea about gut flora, that there are some specific gut flora that actually change sugar. We actually metabolize the sugar into alcohol so that the person really does get drunk.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
And that was what makes nutrition so awesome and exciting. I think that's what confuses people, is that because you can, and we've talked about this with our functional nutritionists before, of the way people metabolize things can be so different. So there isn't necessarily that blanket approach of everybody kind of resolving these issues, especially when we're talking about hormones and then neurological side all mixed together. And that's why I think what we're covering today is going to be a great place for people to start, but everyone's journey is going to be a little bit different, and what they find is going to. And that's what I like, all the different stories that you have in your book that really highlights that. Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a foundation in place, but you know, everyone's journey is a little bit different.
So going back to the initial question, Dr. D, about, you have people in there that say that it's just comfort, it's just pleasure, I just love it. I would say that's just the first stage, but it doesn't stay there. Like, you have a drink, and after a while, one is just not enough to get the same effect. You're going to need more. Like, addiction isn't something that just stays. It's a gradual, progressive thing.
I mean, and I think
I'm not saying they're going to like that answer.
Yeah, they're not going to like it. And I think really, if we can just, I'm sure that you've had a lot of challenges in trying to have people understand that food addiction is just like any other addiction. And I'm sure you've got some people fighting that idea, but really, I mean, it makes sense. Yes. Yeah. I can see a lot of my patients saying, no, I'm not addicted. What are you talking about? That's only drugs and alcohol.
I know. Yeah. So there's two things. The people that I see who are more open to my experience, I'll tell you the classic person who's the most open. They're the ones that say, thank you, Vera. I'm so glad that we're talking about this. They're people who have already had bariatric surgery. They've already had it. And now they're gaining weight. There's nothing more devastating than having gone through that process and now you're gaining weight again.
Yep.
They're the ones who are willing to listen. In other words, they've gone, there's nowhere else left on the block. Now they have to listen.
Right, none of the habits have been addressed that got them there in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. But how do we get them to listen right when they're in your office?
Right.
That's right.
That's the key.
Yep.
It has to be societal.
Yep. And here, Dr. V, we see it a lot because people do want to go to a quick solution. Somehow there's something about this culture, or maybe it's even this new generation. And I know that you have talked a lot about this digital world that we live in. So it's isolating people more, which means that they're going to eat by themselves more. So this is happening here, the 21st century. They're using a lot more social media. I have a client, she's 21 years old, and she she's on antipsychotic medication. So it's making her, of course, because I know that it made them gain weight. So it makes her gain weight. All right. So I said to her, why don't we start you knowing that you're gaining weight? I mean, I've seen her for a year and I've seen her explode in weight. So I say to her, we really got to do something. Why don't we talk about the way you eat? No, she likes all these, all the pastries. She likes all the sweet because it soothes. And as you can tell, that serotonin and dopamine is down. And then I said, do you know what she says to me? It's okay, Dr. D, because now I'm talking to a surgeon who's gonna do the sleeve, and I'm going to 21. And then I said to her, fine, because here what I see, I've seen a lot of patients that have gone through the surgery 3 years later. I don't know what the mark about 3 years later. Then they've gained all the weight, and so they gain weight here. And I tell her, and she's like, no, all my problem will be solved. So these are the struggles that having. And then I'm like, well, if you don't learn how to eat right, it's going to come back.
Yes. If I can say, One of the things about the antipsychotics and also
Yes.
antidepressants, but more antipsychotics, it's not just that the person gains weight, but they want more sugar. Like it
Yep.
actually changes
Very
the
true.
insulin hormonal
That's right.
fine tuning in such a way that they want to eat that sweet. So it's a physiological drive that is imposed upon them by these medications.
That's true because
High
since
dose.
she takes a
Yes.
high dose, and the idea
Yes.
is that she craves chocolate all the time. She craves a lot of the sweets,
Yes.
which has made her gain weight. And now she's lost hope.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
can't exit here because they want a quick fix. And she assumes that this is going to solve her problem
Yeah.
because there is no
This is-
self-control.
This is the quick fix that's happened to her. She took the medication, and that makes her want to eat, which then makes her crash. She gets lethargic and she gets depressed about herself. So therefore, her meds have to go up, and she eats more. It becomes
It's a cycle.
momentum in the wrong way.
That's-
And the same thing's going to happen with the surgery. I'm sorry to say,
Yep.
from my experience.
I know because I see it regularly here. And unfortunately,
And-
she's only 21.
About the difference between comfort eating or
Yes.
emotional eating and food addiction, also there's an important distinction, and that is that even if you're eating this food from our Western processed food, it doesn't matter what mood you're in, whether you're happy, sad, glad, mad, it doesn't matter, you're going to want to eat. So you may have started by eating emotionally, but once you're eating this food, emotions become insignificant. You're just eating this food because that's the addiction. It's like I might have started smoking cigarettes because I was a teenager and I wanted to look cool, but at a certain point, it doesn't matter. It's not cool anymore.
Right.
I'm aging, and I whatever it is that the cigarettes do, and I can't quit anymore. And that's what happens with food addiction eventually. And that's the point at which I see people. But you, Dr. D, see them at the beginning of the road, it sounds like.
Yes.
And wouldn't it be nice if we could nab the problem in your office?
Yep. I'm hoping that you and I can work together to resolve this
Yes.
situation because it is very true. But this society is very
societal.
difficult. Yes.
Yes, not necessarily societal, but familial, like what we say here. So when people come into where I work, the first thing is offer and what we call an abstinent food plan, which is essentially real food, not without refined sugar, and get them eating that. And within 3 or 4 weeks, by the way, I don't want to end this podcast without giving a message of hope. Please, I want to add the message of hope in there, which is that you won't crave this stuff if you stop. But anyway, so we teach people how to not eat that stuff, and they literally feel better by the time they leave. But now the biggest problem is, how are they going to go back into the community with the barbecues and the buffets and deal with the family and deal with all that stuff?
And that's the hardest piece, I think, of Kuwait. We kind of touched on before, especially with the family gatherings and holidays.
Yeah.
And I mean, we touched on especially in Ramadan time, but meals food is entertainment there.
Yeah.
It is a dry country, so it's less on the,
Right.
alcoholism side of the addiction transfer, but food is the entertainment, and meals are long and drawn out, and it is very much a social life for people to do that.
So we have to infiltrate at that level. I mean, somehow, I don't know how it happened, probably religious. You say where you are, it's a dry area. So it's socially acceptable not to drink. In
That's
fact,
right.
it's expected that if we could somehow learn from that, not food, but specific foods, toxic foods like sugars and, white flours and stuff like that, to make that
Put it in the same category.
Yeah, in the same way that we're doing now. I don't know about you guys, but the same way that we're doing it now with cigarettes. Like now, you feel like a pariah as a smoker. And it was only 10 years ago that it was very acceptable.
Well, even in Kuwait, less than that. I think when I moved there in 2014, you could still smoke in the airport and the malls anywhere you wanted to. I mean, it's only been a couple of years where they've kind of push that into there's like little smoking tanks you can go in now.
Right. But
That's true.
I think it's at that level that's what we need to do.
I think if we can just be able to educate people about sugar. So you mentioned 2 types of food, which is sugar and flour. But the idea is that I think education, we are a dry country, but we do have drug and rehab units here. So drugs are big here, cocaine, heroin, as you can think, because people have more money here, so they can spend more. But the idea is that it's the same struggle, just like an addict when he leaves the rehab and he is going and he's worried about being able to sustain from this drug. It's the same thing. But if we can get people to really understand that this is an addiction, the more we can educate, because obviously, in this country, they're realizing that drugs and alcohol is bad for you. And I think we need to find somehow to really do what you are doing and get people to really understand this is an addiction. If I knew I was an addict when I go to these family gathering, I will not touch sugar because it's an addiction.
Right.
But it's still people are not understanding the process of addiction.
Right. So some of it might be if we can destigmatize the whole concept of addiction so that it's not like, what's wrong with you, Dr. D? Like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
But that this is just, well, I'm a diabetic. And I actually think that people who are diabetic actually have more of a tendency to be food addicts. Like I think that the insulin receptor blunting that happens with diabetes, a similar process is happening in the brain with dopamine, which, by the way, I haven't really addressed the dopamine thing, which I can if you still want me to.
Yes.
I think a similar thing is happening. So if we could just say, look, I'm a diabetic, I can't have this stuff, and people say, okay, if we could say the same thing, look, I'm a food addict or I'm a sugar addict, but I can't eat sugar.
Yep.
I'm
allergic to it.
Me. It makes me anxious. Yes. Well, essentially, you are allergic to it. You have a hypersensitive response to sugar.
Yes.
And that's what's hard, I think, is people saying, like, when they say that I can't have something, it automatically goes that restrictive mindset. And then the more it's restricted, the more you think, like, God, I really want that thing. And so it's one of the things, the language around it that I've kind of worked with people on, too, is understanding what it does to you and how it makes you feel. And rather than saying, I can't have that thing, I'm choosing
not to because I don't want to get sick.
Exactly. It's just understanding the impact that it's going to have and kind of changing the language around it. As soon as you say, I'm choosing not to have it, now it's a little bit more of the responsibility. I know how this makes me feel rather than I can't and someone else told me it's bad for me.
Sugar makes me anxious and I don't want to be anxious. Sugar makes me depressed and I don't want to be depressed.
Exactly.
Now, I have another science question. I don't know. For some reason, I'm the geek. Usually Meg's the geek on the show. It's like,
I would think I should be the one asking these questions.
No, but I've geeked out on your book. So. And I read a couple of articles too, and in recent readings over the past few months, I've read some things that are saying that type 3 diabetes, there's a link to dementia and Alzheimer's, I think.
That's right.
So
we've talked about this before, I think, in the episode with the researchers from Australia when we talked about diabetes, I think with that.
Yes.
From your medical opinion, is the link there yet? Because right now in Kuwait, we're seeing a huge influx in dementia. Especially. I mean, I know at least 10 households where they have an elder family member that has been stricken by dementia or Alzheimer's. And it's just blown up ever since after the Gulf War. And I'm not saying that it has to do with the Gulf War and whatever chemicals were used or whatever, but that's when the real introduction of Western foods started to come into Kuwait.
Yeah, and I'm more inclined to think that sugar is the neurotoxin that will lead to Alzheimer's and maybe even Parkinson's, certainly mood disorders. But is the science there? I think there is science there, but is it reliable enough? I don't think we're at that stage. It's strongly suggestive. It's correlational. I don't know if it's causational yet. But those of us in the field are willing enough to say, this looks very much like there is a causation, but we can't say that that's for sure the case. But I am prepared to say that it's a neurotoxin, sugar, and that nothing else. It causes mood disorder and it causes addiction to other things, not just sugar, but other things. So let me talk a little bit about that dopamine 2 thing that you had asked earlier. When we understand addiction, there are more neurochemicals than just dopamine, but that's the one that's been studied the most. So you can understand a lot just on looking at that level. We know that hunger creates a dopamine rush. I mean, it's connected to dopamine. We also know that sugar, cocaine, other drugs also create an influx of dopamine. We know that just anticipating, in other words, a sweetener, can cause a dopamine rush. In normal life, dopamine is meant to get me through the day to just appreciate a conversation like we're having. I'm not supposed to be on way out in the Netherlands exploding into, I don't know, basically the extraordinary thanks to sugar. Just like insulin receptors, it's the constant bombardment of sugar and whatever, high stimulation. Then if I don't have anything, I get flat. I'm depressed. Yeah. Now I got an emotional problem.
I think chapter 8, you went through some of the withdrawal symptoms and post-acute withdrawal symptoms. That's the one thing I took from the book. So
when we talk about addiction, we acknowledge that there is, with any syndrome, any addiction, there's a withdrawal. Whatever extraordinary experience you have, the body adapts to that to make it normal. And then when you stop it, you need that stuff to feel normal. And now you don't have it. And so now you're going to feel the opposite. So the opiate person has no pain and they're sedated and they're constipated, stop the opiate, and now they have diarrhea and they're feeling full of pain and extremely depressed because it's the opposite. Sugar, you get that buzz of whatever it is that you get. You stop that and it's the irritability. I can't sleep. My fuel is coming down. It's even to the point where the person is shaking, is sweating, can't sleep, diarrhea the next day. Now, that's extreme. That's somebody who's probably binged all night. But it is what we see happening once you get to the end of the spectrum with food addiction. And, we can ask people who don't believe in food addiction. They'll say, there's no withdrawal syndrome. But you ask anybody who's been eating this way for a while, and they will say, yes, it takes about a week before I feel back to normal again.
I know for myself, it was a lot of like headaches and like brain fog and that kind of stuff in the beginning when I detoxed from sugar. Yes. And then that's how I've talked about this before. That's how I found the link between sugar and my arthritis. And I don't have to deal with arthritis medications or anything like that now from paying attention. I mean, obviously there's sugar in fruit and some natural sugars and things like that. But
when you had the withdrawal, how was your emotion?
Oh, I was grumpy. I was very irritable, very grumpy.
And how long did that last?
It was about a week. It was about a week. It was kind of, we called that phase like getting off the crack is how we just, the group that I did it with. And that's how we kind of described it. It was just, it took about a week and then the mental clarity and things kind of came after that. And then just feeling better in the joints. So it does happen. And I think this is the part with people who deal with kids. And that's a hard phase for when you're trying to, go through a family change, maybe, and making behavior change all around, is that the kids, I mean, their emotions are way more escalated than what we feel. And they're way more irritable and up and down and the aches and all that kind of stuff, but they get through it.
We call that attention deficit disorder.
Right, exactly.
Right. I call it a sugar high.
Yes.
I just call it what it is. I say my
But
son.
it gets labeled as a ADD.
And
or ADHD, yes.
We give them stimulant medication, which suppresses appetite. Right. And then they lose their cue of what's hunger and what isn't hunger. Mm-hmm.
It's frustrating. We have talked a lot about like the sugar aspect of it, but there's still, I encounter some clients sometimes that they are eating what is considered a relatively whole food diet, paleo diet, but they will still overeat large amounts. So they're eating, less of the processed things. They're eating more of what we consider a healthy diet, but they still have a struggle with just controlling portions or, how much they eat in that time. Is that still considered like an emotional eating? Is that considered an addiction, or where does that kind of fall on the spectrum? If it's not so much of the sugar that they're trying to detox from, it's just food in general or meal size or, things like that.
I would need to know more information, but the thought that comes to mind is, how carb sensitive are they? Mm-hmm. And I do think that some cultures are more carb sensitive than others. Like, here in Canada and America, our Aboriginal populations are so carb sensitive that they look at toast and they've got diabetes. I mean, it's just...
The insulin spikes just looking at the thing.
I mentioned that earlier when we first started, that there are some new products coming out on the scene. One of them is the Lumen. And I really don't care to mention brands, but they've advertised as they can tell if you're carb sensitive by you blow into it and it gives you a reading. Can you talk about that a little bit? The science behind that? Is there any fact behind it? Is it legit, or is it just kind of a marketing ploy?
I would have to say I don't know, because I don't know that product. I'm going to claim ignorance, but I'm going to give you a thought. If they're using the concept that what we're essentially measuring is insulin sensitivity, which would be the same as saying carb sensitive, it has logical thinking behind it. But we all know that something that's logical thinking doesn't necessarily mean that the product I have is truly measuring that. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like the Fitbit thing, when people are all those steps, you're somehow making the implication that you're having a healthy lifestyle. Not necessarily, not if you're eating muffins all the time.
Right.
So I don't actually know if the promise delivers, but I think what they're saying makes sense. And that's probably how they're selling it, is by its logic.
You have tried to distinguish between eating disorder and an addiction of food. So I wanted to see, can you help me understand what you think? Because a lot of the things you talk about as the addiction of food kind of fits into the purging. Some anorexia, some bulimia, but the purging part, it does, because they're overeating. And Meg was just talking about people that are overeating. The idea is that when, so someone that can come into my office, and if I don't know enough about addiction of food, I would say that they would be in those three categories of eating disorder.
Yes. You're asking me a question that is the bane of our existence. Like, this is the biggest struggle. And if anybody could answer it, they'd get the Nobel Prize in dietary. I'm sure they would. Let me go back, Meg, to your question first, and then I'm going to go to what is it about the person who's volume eating? Like, are they eating grains? Maybe it's healthy food for most people, but they can't eat some of the more complex carbs that, like, they can't eat potatoes where most people still could, or they can't eat grains like quinoa and rice where others could. And that might still be driving the addiction because they're so carb sensitive. That's a possibility. The other possibility is, now we're moving into Dr. D's area, is that if the person has been eating problematically for a long time, they start to develop addictive food behaviors like just volume eating. I don't care what it is, I'm just eating a lot.
That's true.
Which then looks an awful lot like a binge disorder. And now to answer your question, the tools that we have to measure food addiction are highly sensitive. They will pick up food addiction and they will pick up eating disorder, but they are not specific. I cannot rule one or the other out. It's very frustrating. And it's the reason why we can't get this condition acknowledged, because people will just say it's an eating disorder. The best that we have is that there is somebody in Sweden now who's Bitten Johnson, who's working on a tool to make a distinction. But the way that we do it now is, if the person, like you, Meg, stopped eating a particular thing and had a response of food serenity after 3 weeks, just because of the food you've changed, not anything else, and you feel quiet, then I'm going to say that that is a strong signifier of food addiction. Whereas somebody with an eating disorder, it only makes it worse, because the restrictions, what will feel restrictive, will just feel like ongoing eating disorder behavior. It's almost like whatever solution works, that's going to help me give the diagnosis. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes.
It's an unfortunate way, because we're working from the back going forward. It would be much better to have something at the very beginning. If anyone's looking for a PhD topic, that's it.
That's it, yeah.
But Dr. V, why do we need to distinguish it? Why can't we put it with the eating disorder? I mean, people might ask you that. Why do you want to bring in another diagnosis?
Okay. Because, that is essentially what Health Canada says, and the DSM-5, the committee said when food addiction proponents came and said, here's a disorder, please accept us. The DSM-5 committee said, I'm sorry, how is this different than binge eating? And we don't need anything. We got binge eating. But we would say that it's very important to make a distinction, because in the eating disorder model, it is almost sacrosanct to learn how to eat normally, like the way that my family eats and my society eats, but in moderation. And a food addict cannot do that. It's the same as if you quit smoking cigarettes. I cannot just have one cigarette on the weekend if I was a pack-a-day smoker before. If I wasn't, maybe I could. But if I was a pack-a-day smoker or a bottle a day, a wine drinker, I can't just have one drink on the weekend. It's only going to make me want to have more. The principle about food addiction being, once that dopamine receptor has been kindled, primed to have that heightened response to sugar, the moment the sugar enters, it inflames the whole system. And what does that feel like when the system is inflamed? It's the term of what we call the phenomena of craving. I crave more sugar. What is that? That's dopamine. What's actually happening is a dopamine spike, but I experienced that dopamine spike by, I want more sugar. I didn't until I had this hot chocolate, but now I want a piece of cake, but with the hot chocolate. And then I go home tonight, and now I want the ice cream that I used to have. All of that is dopamine, that is hypersensitive response to one little thing. So eating disorder says the treatment for eating disorder is learn how to have a little piece of cake once a day. A food addiction would say no, never.
No cake ever again. Yeah.
But not with, not with the sense of restriction, but with the sense of freedom.
Right.
Well, thank you very much. So I guess you're saying that addiction of food has the specific, which we're talking about sugar, but also how it really kindles the dopamine receptors. That's what you're saying.
Yes.
So, and then you're saying that even though eating disorder in general, especially the purge eating, I mean, we're talking about the same kind of neurotransmitters, the dopamine, serotonin. Yes. We have the same thing, but you're saying that they are activated in a different way.
Yes. Now, some of us will say, I'm not so sure that we're activated in a different way.
Okay.
I'm more inclined to say, and some of us, here's where there's many different PhD theses, some of us would say, like me, that the eating disorder is actually an earlier phase of a later stage food addiction. The eating disorder can still do a little bit, and they'll struggle and they'll get the comfort, but they can moderate, but they haven't moved along because we see that happening. People end up saying, hi, I'm Vera, I'm a food addict and a bulimic, both.
That's
But
true.
really the fundamental difference is it's about the physiology of introduce the food, sparks up the desire, what we call the phenomena of craving, and then you're lost.
That's
And
true.
that phenomena of craving could translate into just eating behavior, like volume addiction.
Right. You said this in some of your interviews that people really need to understand whatever it is that they're addicted to. If they stop their addiction, everything gets back. And then you also say that a lot of times, like when people stop their addiction, and I don't work a lot with substance abuse, but I'm sure that you've had patients where they say somehow when they stop their addiction, their brain even goes to norm. And for food addiction, I've heard you say that, if we can help people understand, it only takes 3 to 4 weeks or 1 month.
Yes. The message of hope is that if you stop the addictive foods, and that doesn't mean you can't stop eating tasty food. You can still really enjoy your food. It's just you stop eating the highly processed flour and sugar and those kinds of foods. After the withdrawal, which lasts a week to 2, you actually go back to just enjoying regular food.
Yes.
I had another question about the book. It was probably my favorite story in the book. One of them was your story, which I thought was extremely fascinating. And you talked about it on a recent podcast also, of how you realized that you had an addiction to food when you were working at a senior citizen home, if I believe, right? If I'm not mistaken. And then the other story I was hoping you could dive into both of these stories a little bit and just kind of give like a snippet of them, was Lawrence's story, the food addict and heroin addict. And like I said, that broke my heart because in Kuwait, we have a huge heroin problem that no one talks about.
Yep.
And there's a huge heroin problem in the United States. I think it's a global mess right now. So can you dive into both of those stories a little bit to give our listeners an idea of how this book is? Because it's not a geeky science book. It's actually got some real life stories in there.
Actually, it's an easy read.
I
too.
start with my story in there because I feel like my story is so common with the young woman in university who is worried about her weight. I probably wasn't that, but I thought I was, and started to fool around with the foods that I was eating, thinking that I had to cut my calories because I believed in the model of calories in, calories out. Of course, I'm going to save the favorite ones, which are the sugars, and just eat those and not eat the other stuff. And before I knew it, I became obsessed, absolutely obsessed, 24/7 thinking about food. And my guess is that probably the quickness of that, because that took 2-3 years to get there, was probably because I have a family history of alcoholism and my mother was an alcoholic. And I think that I probably had receptors that were not necessarily addictive personality, but addictive genes. So there it was waiting to happen. And I wanted to use my example because I didn't feel like I was the typical addict, the stigma of that. I was just a regular university person who now, in anything that I did, school, relationships, going to a movie, what was first on my mind was, could I eat, or how much did I have to burn off so I could eat later? And then it was like this nest of bees in front, and then everything else was there. And I was navigating that, but the bees of those thoughts were in front of me. And it wasn't until 30 years later of trying to manage this that because I became an addictions doctor, that I thought, okay, I'm going to treat this like an addiction and just stop the sugar and see what happens. And that nest was gone in a number of months. It was like, oh my God, what took me so long? Well, I didn't know. And so now I'm on this campaign to talk about this. Lawrence was an example of a fellow that I met. He was a real patient that I was seeing. I work at a treatment center, but I also had a small practice of opiate addicts, and we were giving a methadone. And he was somebody who's quite obese and had been a heroin addict for years. And not everybody who's a heroin addict, that they are. What he did is he would have customers, and with those customers that he would sell to, he would get enough for himself by selling a bit more than he had to pay for. And that was how he was able to be a art dealer and all sorts of things that he was, along with being a sort of functional heroin addict, first from New York and then came to Toronto for a number of years. But then he got heavier and heavier and was not able to get out very much. He ended up having less customers and therefore more in need of heroin because he couldn't afford it as much. And I think he managed by eating more and using less heroin, like almost like a kind of juggling act, until he finally got to a place where he had, I think, 3 or 4 customers that gave him just enough heroin so that he wouldn't be sick. But now he was morbidly obese. I mean, I guessed him to be in the 400 plus, but he could have been more. He was to the point where he couldn't get out of bed anymore. He had somebody rig up an iron thing that he had to hang on to, so he could literally pull himself over to the pail where he would go to the bathroom. And then he had somebody that was staying there to help him. So he had to stop his opiate use, and he would do that with methadone. So I would come and give him the methadone, and I thought, let's deal with the food thing at the same time. So we got him off the opiates, but we never managed to get him off the food. And because he was so heavy, I think I was only seeing him for about a year until he finally had a heart attack. And he told me he had a number of times where he had chest pain and what was clearly signs that you should be going to the emerge because of angina. But he wouldn't go because he was so embarrassed. I mean, he was too big to go in a regular ambulance. Like, it would have required, extra effort. And I mean, that's really his story. Somebody who started his addiction with opiates, and then it ended up being, basically food. He did not die of an opiate addiction. He died of his, basically a heart attack. But we say that was food addiction.
Wow.
Wow.
The significance of adding some of these stories to your book, was that just to kind of relate to the readers a little bit more?
Yes. So that what I really wanted was that when somebody read that they would go, that makes sense. Because you say food addiction and people go, what? I'm not addicted to food. Like your experience, Dr. D. What are you talking about? But when you read it, it's like, well, wait a minute. I can relate to that. And also to give some compassion to, like, I think that part of the reason why we don't see food addiction or sugar addiction as extreme, when I see a crack addict on the street, well, I'm walking by them. They're, on laying by a vent, with cardboard boxes. It's visible. Food addiction at its end stage, there are people that are up in their attic or their third floor. They're shut-ins. They're having people deliver food to them, their pizzas or whatever. They don't go out anymore, and then they die. We don't see that extreme. And I wanted people to see that it's like this thing that's just below our consciousness. We know it's there. We're not really willing to look at it, but it's there, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And once in a while we see, heart attack, diabetes. Well, there's a lot of diabetes now, but we don't see that the beast is actually addiction. And I wanted people to see different views of that addiction so they could go, yeah, that could be me.
I think these stories, especially knowing that you had a food addiction, because sometimes you get people writing books or are expert in certain areas. Not that everyone should have personal experience in the area they study, but I feel like in your book, it really made it so real, because this is someone that calls herself a food addict, is in recovery. And so when you use those terminology, actually, I want to confess to you, I think after I read this, I think I have a food addiction, or had. Now I work out. Now I work out. But talking about when I was in college, I had similar situations. So I felt like, wow, I wish somebody then would have told me I had food addiction. Of course, 3 years ago, I changed my lifestyle. I work out. I exercise. I don't eat sugar. I look great for myself. I mean, if you knew me 3 years ago and you see me, you don't recognize me. So when I read your story, I thought, wow, this is really me. I could relate. And I felt like it's so nice to read a book from someone that already was there versus someone else that wasn't there and is just talking about it in a more hypothetical, research way. So I really appreciate your honesty. That was amazing.
Yeah. I thank you for saying that. And I really wrestled with bringing myself in like that, because it's a little bit embarrassing, some of the stories that I told. And then in the end, I thought, what have I got to lose? It's just ego, and for God's sakes, if it makes a difference. So to you, it spoke to you.
Oh, it did.
And I thank you for telling me that, because it makes it worthwhile. Because, it is a bit embarrassing. But the more you and I and others speak about this, the more we destigmatize this thing.
Well, and I think that's like the hard thing, especially like Dinka in your field, working with mindset and things. It's like, you're human, you still struggle with,
that's right.
decisions and, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, I'm in the health field and I still struggle. Like, it's still a conscious decision, with food and behaviors and habits and stuff sometimes. So it's just,
Yes.
it does make us relatable. Like I'm a health coach, but I'm not the health coach that has like the 6-pack and that has, like this picture perfect body that people think they're supposed to have. And to me, I hope that makes me more relatable because we've talked about this before, like chasing the abs and like what that sacrifice comes from and, is it really worth it? But I think on all these fronts of like you being a doctor and holding a PhD, like people probably think like, oh, it just must be so easy for her to know and understand all of this. But it's been a work in progress. It's been years of experience. And I think that's the benefit to all of us. And Maddie too, with your history of being overweight and smoking and overcoming all that kind of stuff, like people just need to understand that that's human. That doesn't make you a bad person because you've had this experience on your timeline. What are you going to be able to do with that experience?
Yeah, that's true.
One last point, I think, before we kind of wrap up, and I'm stealing one of Dr. Dinka's questions. We were talking about this earlier, and it was about exercise. She actually reminded me about this point in the book that you brought up about supplementing the addiction to exercise and, being like, oh, and we hear this in CrossFit. I'm a CrossFitter. I hate to say it, but I am. And we hear it all the time. I'm doing the WOD for the food or the cheat meal WOD, as they call it, right, Meg? You can relate to that. So now, how do you get away from if you kick your addiction to food and then you become addicted to exercise because you're going to fry your central nervous system and you're just going to keep going down this dangerous rabbit hole. So you talk about that in the book a little bit, and you seem like you kind of stay away from the exercise model or the fitness industry model, which the fitness industry is crap anyways. Let's be realistic. It's full of lies and cheats and snake oil salesmen. But so if you can dive into that a little bit, that would be great.
I probably avoided it because I did what so many other people did. I did a ton of exercise to basically, be able to have that little extra. Because remember, when I was living in this 30 years of wandering in the wilderness, basically, of trying to manage how much can I eat? How much do I have to burn off? I mean, I would run an hour a day and then I had a gym downstairs. And so that when I stopped eating the food, it was like, I'm not doing that exercise thing. So I got out of it that way. I encourage exercise now because one of the things that happens when you stop eating this food is you get a ton of energy that you didn't have before. And the actual pleasure of walking and climbing and running and biking comes back. It's like when you're a little kid and you enjoy that stuff again. I did not enjoy running and doing that hour of exercise in the basement to lose the however many pounds. I think that probably people can use exercise as an addiction too, but that wasn't my story, so I can't really speak to that. I'll be happy to listen to you if you want to share. You probably have lots of stories of people who have come to you.
I think that the idea is that you also mentioned social support. So not to remove, there are lots of people, like, for example, anorexic, which what they do is they're obsessed with food, but they're trying to stay away from food. So they'll obsess over exercising. I had patients like they'll work out 2 or 3 times. I have students, I also teach at the university here, where, the whole time they're spending time is chewing gum, drinking water, and they're in the gym at the university, maybe 2 hours. So there's an obsession about it. You're right. But and then sometimes people like, well, it's better than eating. So at least I'll spend most of my time in the gym, which, again, it's like running away. They're in denial of a problem. Instead of facing it, they're running away to something else.
And then it's not even that they're in denial of the problem, but they're still obsessed about something. And that's such an unhappy place to be.
That's true.
In a way of wrapping up here, what I'd like to suggest is this is not about restricting. This is about liberating.
Yeah, that's right.
Liberating from this obsession to lose weight, burn off the calories, and, what can I eat that I can feel okay on? It's like freedom from all of that.
That's right.
And that freedom can be achieved within 3 weeks. It's not even like years. It's 3 weeks. But the rest of life is going to be, how can I protect that? Because I'm living in a society that doesn't understand.
Right. But if you really explain to them that after 3 weeks, you are going to be free from the mood disorders. You're going to be free from being tired all the time. You are going to be free of this unhappiness. You'll be a happy person. Like I share my story. When I was overweight, even though I've always been active and really worked very hard, but still it was a push. Now I wake up, I'm excited when my trainer comes. I'm excited for the day. You have a different type of energy. And I use myself. I tell them my stories because they need to know that I'm not just giving them this because I am, a psychologist, but because I'm human and this happened to me.
Yes.
Yes.
And you want to share this.
That's right.
Yeah. And so, you have the experience. I mean, it gives us the passion that we have to withstand the response, to be able to withstand and to continue on and preach this message. It only takes 3 or 4 weeks. Yes. It's not just 3 or 4 weeks of mood. It's like within 6 months, half of your weight will be gone.
That's right.
I lost 100 pounds and I've kept it off. Like that's great news.
That's right.
Not in 3 weeks, but in a year.
That's right.
Great. Like you will have a new life.
Yeah, I think that's the difference, is that you're able to keep it off, whereas the diet culture and the fitness industry kind of depend on you putting it back on, the cycle back in the addiction industry as well.
The diet and the bariatric culture, the surgery culture.
Totally.
So true.
I think that's amazing. I think we've covered so many great things that are going to help people just understand that there is light at the end of the tunnel and give them that little ray of hope. Yeah. I think it would be cool if people listening to this, if they had, follow-up questions or anything that, is still confusing on the addiction and eating disorder, that, maybe we could bring you on for a part 2 or something of this, because I just think this topic can't be discussed enough.
I'm so thrilled to be
from Kuwait and over to our side of the world. I think it's a problem.
This is such a thrill to be speaking, across the world like this. Like really,
maybe
I'm so delighted.
I don't know.
Dr. V, we're thinking of bringing you here.
Yeah, Dr. V.
We want you to come and do a talk for a lot of people, and people do speak English here, so it'd be nice if you can come and talk about your book in person. So I hope you're open to coming to Kuwait.
As long as I don't have to eat the food.
Besides your book,
we have some good food.
Besides your book and the podcast and things, are there any other places, or do you have any upcoming webinars or any upcoming workshops or things around that you speak at, or what are other ways that people can?
I think it's best if I just send you my website. Yeah,
I got all those links. I can put them all in the show notes, without a doubt, definitely. Dr. Vera, thank you so much. I think this was a great episode. We'd love to definitely have you again, and I'll probably get some more sciencey questions so I can geek out a little bit more than Meg this time. I mean, she was asking all the fluffy questions. I got a psychologist and someone asking the fluffy stuff. I don't know what to do anymore.
We wanted you to be the...
If you're going to ask me geeky stuff, send it ahead. Like that lumen thing, then I could look that up.
Yeah, I'll send you the link. I saw that the other day on Instagram. It was the weirdest thing. And Meg, have you seen it? I don't know if it's just in Kuwait, but I saw it here.
I've heard about them before. I haven't used it, but I've heard that there are ones. And it's kind of interesting, actually, even with your Fitbit, you can look at after eating something like a piece of cake or taking a bite and watching your heart rate change on your
phone. Oh, wow.
See, I've done it with HRV. I've done it with the chest strap. I've done it with the legit chest strap and the HRV. And you can actually tell. And they give you complete instructions 20 minutes after you eat. And I was obsessed at one point with recovery and waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to take my HRV before I started my day. And then I was doing it after meals and chicken. And I told Meg about this. She knows.
But you know what? This might not be a bad idea, because if people are conscientious about their heart rate and how high their insulin, maybe they will, because then they will be more scared, and being scared maybe will help them stop these foods. It could work.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. V. It was great talking to you.
Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. You can also find us on Instagram at The Project Kuwait. Thank you, and join us next time.